flattered to see so many people I know in the audience, and so many, in particular, ambassadors who've come this evening. It's you know, when you spend 6 years, or I think it's actually, depending on how you count, 7 years doing a book like this, most of which you've spent sitting by yourself in an archive, you know, in some rainy country in the dark. It's very nice that when it's finished, that people actually want to hear about it. So I'm grateful, really, to you all for being here tonight. I was asked not to make a real speech. I said I did have one prepared, and I can swap over and do that if you want. But I was told to just outline the book a little bit, and then the extremely distinguished, as we're all distinguished, Geoffrey Hosking will ask me questions about it, which we'll give you, and then we'll move on to other questions. In some sense, the origins of this book do lie in my previous book about the Gulag, not in a direct way. This is not a sequel of any kind. But while writing the Gulag book, I became very interested in the question of why people go along with, why they went along with Soviet communism, and what was the nature of Soviet ideology, and what was so compelling about it, why did it work? And it began to seem to me that one of the places where you can see where it was imposed most quickly, if you look at the development of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, you know, it goes backwards and forwards. It takes a long time. The pieces, the different building blocks of the system come in at different moments. But in 1944 and 1945, the Soviet Union had the opportunity to bring its system to other countries. And there, for the first time, you can see, in a way, what the building blocks of the system were, or what they thought they were, from their point of view. In other words, what did the Red Army and the NKVD do when they got to Eastern Europe? I should say, Stalin did not have in 44 and 45 a plan. He didn't have a kind of master plan. He was sketching out what was going to happen when. And there is a document that was written during the war by his foreign ministry, which talks about the shape of post-war Europe. And I think Litvinov who writes it, says, well, we do expect, of course, in line with Marxist ideology, Marxist-Leninist ideology, of course we expect the international revolution to spread, and eventually all of Europe will be communist countries, naturally, but of course it might take a long time, and then he was guessing 20 or 30 years. So the idea was, of course it will eventually be, all of Europe will be dominated by a communist system, just like the world will be dominated by the communist system. And actually, I wouldn't underestimate the kind of confidence that that ideology gave to the Russians and the other Soviet leaders who came into the region. Of course, it might not work out right away, but we know eventually it will work out because, you know, Marxism is a science, and Marx said it would happen, so it will. Nevertheless, they weren't taking an enormous amount of chances. And so there were, even while, in the very beginning, of course, initially there was a lot of chaos. One of the things I described in the book is the level of destruction in this half of Europe, which is so much, was so much more profound than anything we knew in Western Europe. Certainly the United States had nothing like it at all. You know, there was an enormous amount of chaos, and in the beginning, the Red Army and the NKVD, as I said, they did not arrive and immediately try to impose complete political systems. They allowed a certain amount of political debate. They allowed a certain amount of public conversation. Nevertheless, there were a few things they did right in the beginning, which they really did in every country. In my book, and I'll have you explain why, I concentrate on 3 countries. And apologies to the Bulgarian ambassador, and apologies to the Czech ambassador, Slovak ambassador. The countries I chose for, I can explain if you want to know, were Poland, Hungary, East Germany. Nevertheless, the pattern is the same almost everywhere with some national differences. There were a few institutions they considered so important that they couldn't just fall into anybody's hands. One of those institutions was the new secret police, which everywhere they set up. They set up along Soviet lines, trained by and in imitation of the NKVD, as it was then called, later the KGB. In those countries where they had enough time to prepare, they created the secret police forces in advance. The creation of what became the Polish secret police force begins in 1939 with the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. That's when they begin recruiting. when they began recruiting mostly very uneducated and mostly from peasant families, Poles, to serve in the post-war secret police, and they began training them, and they continued to train them through the war. There were East Germans. East Germany was more complicated because they didn't immediately trust the Germans enough to give them their own secret police force, although they began very quickly to keep people out once they were in charge. Second thing that they did, and this was not something I expected, but I slowly discovered while doing the research. The other institution they were very keen on controlling right away was radio. So even in a period when there were some independent newspapers, there were some independent press, radio stations were controlled. Literally, the Red Army marched into Berlin and took over the radio station itself, and actually protected it from further destruction. So much of what had been Hitler's main radio station was intact in May 1945. In Poland, it's more complicated because just about every piece of radio equipment in Poland was destroyed during the war. It was actually the Soviet Union which came and set up, and the new Polish radio station was set up. New post-war Polish radio was set up with Soviet funding immediately after the war, and was under Soviet control and Communist Party control right from the beginning. The same is true in Hungary, and the same is true in most of the bloc. I concluded after reading quite a lot of radio archives that this was because they reckoned, this is an interesting point, they reckoned that the radio was important because the radio was the medium which would be listened to by the workers and the peasants, by the people who they wanted to reach most of all. And at this point, the local communist parties and to some extent the Soviet Communist Party believed that these people would be and could be won over. In other words, there would be a revolution really was going to happen in these areas, in this part of the world, and the workers and the peasants would come to consciousness of their own destiny as the international proletariat, and they would support the new Soviet system or a new communist system, and that was the path to communism. So they didn't initially think that they would have to force it happening. They thought the radio, they had deep belief in their own propaganda and in the efficacy of their own propaganda, which it's, looking back at all, when we read that kind of propaganda now, it seems silly to us and it's hard to understand, but at that time they very much believed in it. The third thing that they did that was very important was they used a kind of targeted violence. So not mass violence. There was no Katyn massacre after 45, and there weren't random arrests. During the war, at the very end of the war, there was random violence. They became very targeted and careful about who they arrested and what kinds of people they didn't want. They didn't want to have be active. And what they were looking for was people who had been or would be potential leaders, leaders of any kind of independent or national movement or any kind of spontaneous movement at all. And this search for potential leaders went along with an attack on institutions which we now call civil society. So spontaneously forming organizations, very often youth groups. Again, there aren't really youth groups anymore of the kind there were in the 1940s, but the Nazis were very interested in them, obviously, and the Soviet Union was extremely interested in who was running the new Boy Scouts in Poland, who were the Catholic youth leaders in East Germany. There was an attempt to identify who these leaders were, to put different kinds of pressure on them, and eventually to arrest them. I mean, one of the most dangerous things to be in East Germany after 1945 was a Catholic youth leader. I mean, many of them went to prison, and many of them eventually went to the Gulag. Later on, there would be further, this would become even more targeted. There would be a focus on arrests of leaders of the former, both in 1945 and then again later, leaders of the former Polish resistance movement, the Home Army, leaders of the Hungarian resistance. So, in other words, anti-fascists, people who theoretically ought to have been the Red Army's allies in that period, were absolutely targets of suspicion from the very beginning, from 45. And later on, many of them were arrested. The other building block, if you would, of the new system that I'll mention before Professor Hosking's asking questions, is ethnic cleansing. Most of us know that the expulsion of the Germans, which took place across Central Europe, particularly in Poland and Czechoslovakia at this time, was very brutal. It was very, you know, you can understand perhaps it's justified perhaps historically that this was a revenge that was taken on the Germans for the incredibly brutal war. But of course it was not always, might be justified, but it was not just. It was, you know, Germans who had been Nazis were kicked out of the country, and Germans who'd been anti-Nazis were kicked out of the country. There was no distinction made based on how anybody behaved during the war. Germans were rounded up and often put into camps that had recently been vacated. So they were literally the same camps. The German labor camps were reused after the war as pre-deportation camps for German citizens. There is actually one very near where I have a country house in Poland called Pulitzer. Interestingly, remains a prison to this day. There was another form. There were other pieces of ethnic cleansing too, which have been less known and less written about since the end of the war. The exchange of populations between Poland and Ukraine, and Poland and Lithuania, the deportation of Poles from the east and Ukrainians to the west. Exchanges between Slovakia and Hungary. Deportation of Germans from all over the region, including also from Hungary and Slovakia and Czechoslovakia. What the overall effect of these was, there were a number of ways in which this process reinforced communist rule. For one, it was popular. This revenge taking and this rejection of the Germans was looked upon positively. This is particularly true in Poland and Czechoslovakia. By many people, and it was seen as something that we are able to do thanks to the communists. You know, the communists got here, and the Soviets arrived, and they were Soviet. While the deportations were often controlled by the local Communist Party, one of the first things the Czech Communist Party ever really did was involve itself in the deportations of the Sudetenland. That was often the first time people saw communist officials. What it also did was, you know, and this is of course is a part of a bigger story, but the moving of people around, you know, the Poles from the east to the west, the Slovaks and the Hungarians, meant that people who had had their own houses, their own land, were suddenly dependent on the state in new ways. The disruption and the end of a kind of continuity and a continuous way of life also wound up playing into the hands of people who were in favor of nationalization and in favor of more state control. So these were, it was an important piece of how why the communist opposition, takeover was successful. You will notice, I'll conclude by saying you'll notice that I have not mentioned economics. That's because, very interestingly, the major economic changes don't take place right away. There's land reform, which is very significant, more so in some places than others, which is one of the first things that gets done. And land reform is done because it's popular. Again, particularly in Hungary, where there were many millions of landless peasants and very few large landowners. It was good. The local communist parties thought it would be a popular thing to do first. Nationalization, some of that happened quickly because so many factories had been abandoned. Their German owners were gone. Their Jewish owners were gone. That nationalization, in many cases, happened very easily and automatically. The owners weren't there anyway. The more complicated piece of nationalization of industry, which is of the economy, which is retail, small business, that was done later, and it was done later because the local communist parties knew that it would be unpopular, and because initially they were afraid that it would disrupt distribution, and it was already so difficult and shortages so bad they thought it would disrupt things further. I came across a very funny document in the archives, I think dated 1949. It's the East German Politburo having an argument about private shops. And they say food shops. And the problem is these private shops, they simply do better than the state shops. At that point, it's about half and half. They created a state sector. distribution sector to compete with the private sector. They said, that this private sector is just doing better. Their turnover is 30% more, and they're more successful. What do we do about it? And they argue. One voice says, well, maybe we should have there be more private shops since they're doing so well. And then no, somebody else says, that's impossible. The private shops are competing with the state. If we eliminate the private shops, then the state shops will be doing better. And they go back and forth about what to do about this problem. And to me, it illustrates that what becomes a greater problem for this regime over time, which is that they keep expecting things to happen in a certain way. Marx said it, or Stalin said it, or Lenin said it would happen in this order, and things. If we nationalize all of industry, then the economy will work better. If we have nationalized shops, they'll be more fair. And then it doesn't work out that way. So what do we do? And they constantly face this dilemma of their ideology running into reality. Marx and Lenin said that the workers would come to consciousness and they would vote for us into power. And their free elections are actually held in Hungary and in East Germany very early in 45 and 46. And the communists lose these elections, and they're surprised, they're stunned. How can it be that these people aren't voting for us? And the Polish communists run into the same problem with the referendum they hold very early on. How can it be that people aren't voting for us? Well, they're not. And they have to keep finding ways to explain it to themselves. They have to keep they have to keep adjusting the ideology and finding new explanations. And finally, after 2 or 3 years, they essentially give up on trying to have communism develop in what they expect will be an organic way. And there begin to be much more brutal use of violence in 48, 49, and other methods. But I will stop there because Professor Hosking is looking at me expectantly.
Oh,
that's an introduction really to the first part of the book, just to give you a general idea.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. The first thing I want to say really is that this is actually a very important book because nowadays, 20 years after the collapse of communism, not only in East Europe but in the Soviet Union, we tend, I think, to underplay both the attractiveness and the power of communism as it was in Europe after the Second World War. So this is a very important historical dimension that we need to re-engage with. And one can, of course, regard it purely as a matter of power, and many people did. I remember I was brought up with Hugh Seaton Watson on this subject, and Hugh Seaton Watson talked about how the communists took power in various Central and East European countries. And he talked about 3 stages. The first stage was genuine coalition, when the Communist parties tried to work with other political parties. The second stage was bogus coalition, when the Communist parties were still in a kind of coalition, but working systematically to undermine their coalition partners. And then the third stage was one-party communist rule. And all those stages were complete by 1948. And Anne's picture, I think, is similar to this, except that she makes it quite clear that even at the stage that Hugh called genuine coalition, the communists were already working vigorously to undermine their political partners. And I think also what Anne does is to bring out the social and cultural aspects of this. The politics has been quite well written about by Hugh Seaton Watson and others. But what Anne has done through a series of interviews and through use of archives, which have been available now for, say, 15 years or so, but weren't available to earlier writers, she's managed to give us a picture of what life felt like for the people who lived through it. Both the victims and actually also the people who took power, or people who became allies of the oppressors inside their own country. And this is a very important aspect, it seems to me, of the communist takeover. I remember in Anne's previous book, The Gulag, she had a whole chapter on the camp guards. Now this is very interesting because nobody previously had written with any kind of insight or sympathy about camp guards. But Anne had actually taken the trouble to think herself into their mentality. What was it they experienced and why did they behave in such a brutal fashion? Why did they commit atrocities? And I find the same thing here, more of it, which is very interesting. Well, I've got one question I'll start with straight away, which is really the role of the Western powers. Was there anything that the Western powers could have done, anything more effective, to either prevent this process or slow it down or in some way make it less destructive?
I'm not very good at counterfactual history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's for the same reason I'm not good at writing fiction. I can't make stuff up. It's just, I'm just not good. And I do wish that I could. I admire so much fiction writers because they don't have to do any research. They can just sit there and think. It'd be so much simpler. So it's hard for me to imagine a different situation. I mean, there are though a few obvious points. At Yalta, at Tehran, and at Potsdam, particularly Tehran and Yalta, in effect, the lines of who would control which parts of Europe were drawn. As we know, this is a known piece of history, and the mystery only that remains over this a little bit is what did the various sides think that line meant. And Churchill, it seems, had a pretty good idea. He knew that when he drew the line and put Poland on the Soviet side of it, that meant that Poland was going to be dominated with the Soviet Union. Roosevelt seems to have had some more idealistic idea that maybe there would be free elections in Poland, and maybe it would all come out right. He had an idea of the Soviet Union as somehow a great power corresponding to the United States, a kind of new power, and he had more faith in Stalin. But regardless of what they thought they were doing, the effect of drawing the line was that even the way the war was fought at the end, was affected. So, for example, it's pretty clear. For example, to my Czech and Slovak colleagues will know this, that Eisenhower could have taken Prague. The Americans could have conquered Prague, and they could have occupied Czechoslovakia instead of letting the Soviet Union do it. However, he made a decision not to. I'm not going to occupy Czechoslovakia because that's, there's been some vague agreement that that's Stalin's, he's going to occupy Czechoslovakia, and so I'm not going to let them. There's a counterfactual story. What if Hitler had decided after Normandy not to fight so hard on the West? What if there had been no Battle of the Bulge? What if the Allies could have got to Berlin faster? Yeah. Which in some ways is amazing he didn't do. Then you might also have had something that looked right. But anyway, the way the war was fought at the very end was affected by these decisions. And of course, had there been more cynicism about Stalin, and had there been more willingness to take seriously the post-war fate of this part of Europe, then the war might have been fought differently itself, and then it would have looked differently.
Well, actually, why I like counterfactual history, or at least I'm in favour of it in some ways, is that it helps us to think.
I'm not against it, I just can't do it.
Well, it helps us to think ourselves back into the mentality of the people at the time. These things which later happened hadn't yet happened.
Right. No,
so you have to try and put yourself in the situation of people who. I get the impression that actually, if the Western powers had known more about Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, when we had our 70th anniversary here, I called the School of Slavonic Studies the school of little faraway places about which we know nothing. And I think a lot of Western statesmen rather took that view.
Well, it's interesting, if you look at the transcripts at Yalta, and there are now some very, very good books. There's recently a book by a Harvard professor called Sarah Kupluggi, which looks at the story of Yalta from both the American, British, and Soviet archives, from all three records, which is very interesting. But what becomes clear when you read it is that the fate of Central Europe is never anybody's priority except for Stalin's. So Roosevelt, what he's really interested in is the United Nations. And he's setting up this new institution. He wants to make sure the Soviet Union's part of it. He's very interested in having Soviet help in the war against Japan and the Far East. His priorities always lie elsewhere. To the extent that, and there's one sort of extraordinary piece of it where there's a conversation about Lvov, which is for those of you who, I'm sure you all know, but those who don't know, it's a city in eastern Poland that was Polish before the war and is now when the borders of Poland are moved after the war, it remains in Ukraine. And there's somebody who told Roosevelt, I think that Lvov is very important to Poland because there are oil fields around it. And so at some point he makes a comment about shouldn't we include Lvov in Poland, draw the border instead of like this, draw it like that, to include that part of Ukraine. And Stalin seems to say, yeah, that's a very interesting idea. And then Roosevelt kind of forgets about it, and so it doesn't happen. And so thus is the fate of a city and 1 million people decided. And it simply isn't their priority. They aren't that interested in it. There are other questions they're trying to resolve at Yalta. And I think that's part of it. And there is a certain naivete, at least on the part of some of the Americans. But there was also a lot of knowledge of the Soviet Union in the State Department. George Kennedy, there were people. So it's not that nobody knew. It was merely the priorities lay elsewhere. I mean, the one thing I've often thought about also is, after it became clear almost right away that the Yalta Accord, which does say there will be democratic elections in all these countries, it became clear right away that this was not being adhered to. And saying earlier on, recognizing that this was a farce, and that particularly the first Polish referendum was a dishonest vote, it might have clarified things
yes.
a little bit more.
Yeah, because in some ways Stalin was feeling his way, wasn't he? How much
Stalin
he could get away with.
In the very early days, Stalin himself was conscious of Yalta, and he encourages the domestic communist parties to hold these elections because he's conscious that there's been this accord and we need to stick to it, at least for now. And then as it becomes clear that the West isn't paying attention to it anyway, then it becomes easier and easier to violate it. So if there had been more noise about it right away, that might have also been useful.
Well, to take up a very different theme, I thought quite a lot about the circumstances in which a totalitarian society is set up. And it seems to me that the conditions which favour it are a society where, for one reason or another, there is maximum generalized social distrust. That's to say, people on the whole don't trust one another. And the reason for that very often is the breakdown of an old society. And that, of course, was classically the situation you had in most of Central and Eastern Europe in 1944 to 45, in which, especially for young people, it was a bewildering, highly dangerous and difficult situation. You've got people going around the countryside, they've got no papers, and not to be identified as a serious problem. They've got no food, no housing. They've experienced extreme economic dislocation, the failure of national leadership, the failure of all the movements which they'd hoped for. So it's really an extreme situation, and you actually use in your book a very striking phrase, radical loneliness, which seems to me to sum up the situation in which so many people found themselves.
There were two people who I met, in the course of researching this book, who struck me as really embodying this phenomenon. One of them was Tadeusz Konwicki, the Polish writer, who we all know better from his later works on how communism was falling apart. But he was, for a brief period, a Stalinist writer, and I went to see him and discussed it with him. And his story to me made a certain kind of sense. He said, look, I was, the war, and he was a home army fighter. He was in, I don't remember exactly how old he was. He was 18 or 19 at the end of the war. He had been fighting with the home army, and briefly, he was from Vilnius, he'd been fighting with the home army, and for a brief period, the unit he was fighting with turned to fight against the Red Army. As some of you will know, when the Red Army came into that part of Poland, some of the home army units revealed themselves and offered to be allies, and instead what happened is they were disarmed and they were sent to labor camps further east. And so as that began to happen, other units hid themselves and retreated further back into the woods, and his was one of those units. So they for a brief time, they fought against the Soviet Union. And then from what I say, from what he said to me and what he's also written, they then experienced a kind of deterioration. So the war was over. They were still fighting in the woods. They didn't have the wholehearted support of the peasantry anymore. They began stealing from people in order to stay alive. I mean, people wanted the war to be over at that time. And this new complication that now we need to fight another war, not everybody understood that. There was a kind of moral disintegration of this unit that he was fighting with. He finally decided, and people began to desert it slowly. He finally decided to come out of the woods himself, and he realized, he was 18 or 19 years old, and he had, as you say, nothing. He had no identity papers, he had no education, he had no more family, he had no home to go back to. He was from the village, he was from the Vilnius region, which was not even part of Poland anymore. He arrived back in Poland with absolutely nothing and nowhere to start. And he describes drifting around the country for a while. He worked in a factory. He actually worked in different factories in different parts of the country. And he became gradually attracted to not even to socialism, but to the socialist writers movement. He got interested in social realism. And becoming a social realist. He started experimenting with writing, describing the workers around him, and so on. He also talks about how, at that point in his life, every single thing he had believed in had turned out not to be true. Everything he was taught in school about, the solidity of Poland and the success of interwar Poland, everything he'd been taught about the liberal democracies or our allies, England and France, it all seemed false. Where were the liberal democracies? They didn't come to our help at all. I can imagine this must have been even more true in Czechoslovakia. What did England and France do for us? They sold us to Hitler. So there was no, and the war was perceived very much at that time as a failure of capitalism and a failure of democracy. Those systems failed. They didn't, it ended in this terrible crisis. We weren't protected by our leaders. We weren't protected by the people who ruled us. They were wrong. And the search for some new explanation and some totally new way to be, a new kind of society suddenly seemed possible. Remember, the Russians had won the war. They were powerful. They were confident. They had a set of ideas that seemed clear. And so for this brief period, which I think still embarrasses him today, he was a Stalinist. I mean, I won't go into as much detail. I also had a conversation with Hans Modrow, who's East German, who I think he was in the very final East German Politburo, and he then had a role in post-communist left-wing party in East Germany. And he went through a similar transformation, whereas he'd been a Hitler Youth, and he'd been fighting in the Wehrmacht. And he was actually in a POW camp in the Soviet Union at the end of the war, in 45 and 46. And where he was re-educated by, there were German communists and Soviet communists who worked very hard on the POWs, German POWs, and sort of transformed them into communists and sent them back to the country. And he said he was ready to be re-educated. He had been, everything he believed. He had believed in Hitler, in German superiority, we were going to win the war, and it was all false. Everything he had ever been taught was not true. And here were these, people much better educated than him, the educated, German-speaking, Russian Marxists who seemed to know so much more. And he talked about being embarrassed that they knew about German literature, and I didn't know anything about German literature, and they did. And they impressed him, and they seemed to have the answer. Anyway, then he went back to Germany and became a youth, free German youth leader.
I mean, not many Red Army soldiers would have known much German literature, but
there were a few, though.
There were a few, yes, indeed, and amongst the political commissars, and especially the people who were sent in to deal with the local media and so on, that they would have known quite a bit about German literature. And of course, communism, for these uprooted people, communism, first of all, offered an explanation. What would happen to them, which seemed to generate more convincing than what they'd learned earlier. It offered a hope for building a better future. It offered comradeship. It offered an identity, something in which you could put your trust. So,
and then of course, in addition to that, there was, if you decided to dissent from being a communist, you were threatened by violence. You could lose your house. You wouldn't get a job. Your child wouldn't be educated. So there were, people often ask me about this. People don't usually work along one motive. So yes, there's the ideology, but there's also the threat of what happens if you don't believe in the ideology. There's also the fact that, after a certain point, the party controls all these aspects of society, and so you don't have a lot of choices anyway. And it's a lot easier to be a communist at a certain point too. So although there is some element of belief, there are other things pushing you in that direction too.
Well, they become clearer as time goes on. I think at the beginning, 1945, 46, 47, the positive appeal of communism to many people was great. Later on, as you say, it became essential to be a communist or itinerant, to obey the communists.
Not even that much later, people began to feel they had no choice.
Yeah.
Within a couple of years, right. It became difficult not to be, and it became a much harder choice.
Right. Yeah. I'm struck by one thing about Marxism as a system. As you were saying earlier on, communists believed that they were creating a socialist system which was inevitable, and yet, on the other hand, they acted as if it wasn't inevitable at all, as though you had to struggle constantly to set it up. And you had enemies all around you.
Because it never worked the way it was supposed to work. It was supposed to happen in this easy way, and it didn't ever happen in the easy way it was supposed to. And so there must be an explanation, and the explanation is saboteurs, spies, diversionaries. You know, the people aren't behaving the way they're supposed to behave. Therefore, there has to be an explanation. This happens over and over again in both Soviet and East European history, that the events are not unfolding the right way, and therefore we need a scapegoat or a different explanation. But you're right, I mean, and it happens over and over again. And there is, the interesting thing about using archives is that the party and at all levels is having these discussions all the time. You know, here's what we're meant to be doing. It's not happening that way, and why? And they look for answers. But it shows you how important the ideology was. They are taking it seriously, and they, you know, but it's not working, and so why not? So we need to find a new policy.
Yes, because they have no explanation of the things going on. The thing is that they've created a total intellectual system. They've created an organization which demands total trust from its members, and it doesn't work. So you then have to project your distrust onto some other explanation, which can only be that there are enemies.
Spies, yeah.
Spies, enemies, diversions, regulars.
Trotsky, Japanese, Polish spies, yeah.
I was very interested also by the way in which artists and writers, many of whom began with ideals very different from communism, tried to turn themselves into good communists. I remember particularly the case of Max Linder. Yeah, perhaps you'd like to say something about Max Linder, because he started as an abstract painter and a satirist.
And one of the interesting things that happens in the not only in the German arts community and others as well, but particularly in the German arts community, is that, you know, the German visual artists, painters and sculptors, had been subject to an enormous amount of pressure under Hitler. And in particular, the group of avant-garde painters who in the 20s and 30s, and some of the most famous names in 20th century painting, Kandinsky and Otto Dix and so on, they had been, many of them had been very passionate anti-fascists, and many of them were communists. And they, in different ways, survived the war, some by going to France, and some by moving further, and Brecht wound up in Sweden and then in the United States. They then many of them came back to East Berlin at the end of the war, where they were certainly welcomed back, and were expecting to, now we've got rid of Hitler and this awful fascist, and the persecution of decadent artists and so on that we had under Hitler. Now we're going to come back and there'll be sort of paradise for the experimental arts and the avant-garde and so on. Well, guess what? It didn't happen, and there's a moment in sort of 45 where they all come back and they begin painting posters and designing theater sets and so on, and then as in East Germany, actually, there's a moment where social realism is officially brought in. The Russians, I mean, there's a series of articles in the official newspapers saying this is how it's going to be from now on, and elucidating the principles of social realism, and now they have to conform to it. And some of them leave, some of them leave, some of them think, right, well, let's try and understand how this works, and let me try and understand this. And Max Linder is an interesting example. He's an artist who's really a graphic designer mostly, posters. But he was a well-respected painter, German painter, who spent the war in France. and he did work on behalf of the French resistance, and he was an important sort of German-speaking member of the French Communist Party. And he's invited back to East Germany towards the end of the 40s. The East German state became one of its, as it struggled to get more legitimacy, one of its methods was to encourage famous artists and writers to come back to East Berlin and to live there. It's, they were very anxious to get Brecht back, and they would see there were these wonderful letters. Also, we'll send a car to the border to pick you up, and you'll be met with. They would make these offers for artists to get them to come home. And Max Linder comes back and discovers that his method of painting, which is sort of vaguely post-impressionistic, is not acceptable. And he does a project where he designs some posters, and he gets he suddenly is criticized in the press. This is insufficiently, this is not politically correct painting, and he undergoes a kind of crisis. He's then in his 60s, and he's not very well. And here's a German painter who's been living most of his life in France, and it's been his dream to come back to a communist Germany and be a painter there. And so he says, right, I need to learn how to paint, the way a communist paints. And so he kind of reteaches himself painting. How do I do it? And he has a long series of conversations with some of the communist bureaucrats about what a good communist painting is going to be. And he is commissioned to do a mural, which is still there today on what is now. It was called the House of Ministers. It was the sort of main East German government building. It's now the foreign ministry, but it's still there. It's a mural, which is a very classic piece of social realism of a kind of peasant and a worker and somebody on a tractor and an intellectual with the glasses shaking their hands. And this is the work that he, after many months of consultation, he produces this thing. And it's enormous, so it's kind of remarkable, but it is of course hideous. And it went rather rapidly out of favor even in East Germany, where it's considered rather embarrassing. But I went through his letters and his notes and some of the discussions he had with German politicians, East German politicians, and it is a fascinating process. He said, right, I must learn how to do this. And so he remakes his brain, and he remakes his artistic sensibility in order to be able to create this really quite horrible mural. And he's making special. There are a few other cases like that.
Well, I remember in Russia, the extraordinary thing is that even some of the most individualist artists, Pasternak, Mandelstam, Akhmatova, they all tried to write an ode to Stalin. They didn't succeed, or they wrote such a straight
Mandelstam definitely didn't succeed, but they wrote the wrong poem.
That's right. They all wrote the wrong poem. They weren't capable of it. Now, Robin will tell me when I should stand down.
I've got one more question.
I've got one, yes. Well, I've got one more. It's quite this is okay, yes. Well, I'd like to just point briefly to the example of Czechoslovakia, because I'm not criticizing you for not doing it because you've done so much. But Czechoslovakia is an interesting case. It bears out in general what you say, but the fact about Czechoslovakia is that the communism was even more popular there than it was anywhere else in Central and Eastern Europe after the war. And in fact, fairly briefly, yes, very briefly. But the fact is, the Communist Party actually won a more or less free democratic election, at least in Bohemia, Moravia, the Czech lands, in, I think it was March 1946. They got 40% of the vote, which was more than Hitler ever got in free election in Germany. Sorry? Well, I did check this very recently, and I think it was 39 and 42 or something in Moravia and Bohemia. But anyway, it was about 40% of the vote, which is pretty impressive. I think it's the only time the communists have ever won a free democratic election. And yet, paradoxically, this was the country in which the imposition of Soviet communism proved most difficult. I mean, let's say during 1947, it began to look as if the coalition was breaking down. Zdeněk Fierlinger, the man in the Social Democratic Party who was in favor of union with the communists, was actually voted out at a party congress. And then the non-communist ministers began to complain publicly about the way that communists were infiltrating the secret police and the ordinary police. But then in February 1948, they committed the extraordinary mistake of resigning in protest against this. Now, they clearly believed that there was going to be a normal democratic process as a result of their demonstration. They would, their resignation, there would be a government crisis. This would lead to probably another general election, and the communists would have fewer votes as a result. And of course, they were absolutely wrong. The communists organised huge demonstrations. They were well able to do that. And President Bennett accepted the resignations and simply let the communists take over. So it's an interesting case. It does demonstrate the same thing that you're showing, but in a very special way.
Well, I mean, in Czechoslovakia, as everywhere else, the secret police were controlled by the Communist Party and by the Soviet Union. I mean, many of all of the building blocks that I just described were also there.
Yeah.
So that they were prepared in a way.
Yeah.
You had 2 or 3 things that are special about Czechoslovakia, and I'm just embarrassed even talking about this in front of the ambassadors from this part of the world. They know it better than me. But one of them is this profound disillusionment with the West, and with Western democracy after Munich in 1938, on top of a fierce hatred of Germany that led many Czechs to think, right, that our only Czechoslovaks, and we need to then call them, our only friend in the world is going to be the Soviet Union. There was a sense of, I've always mistrusted this idea of Slav brotherhood, because some Slavs seem to feel it and some don't. But anyway, there was a
Czechs felt it.
They seem to believe
Poles
it.
didn't.
Anyway, so there was that special aspect, and as I said before, I think the role in the credibility that the Communist Party gained by its role in the expulsion of the Germans is extremely important as well. Nevertheless, I would note that although, as you say, the communists did well in the elections in 46, from my reading of that piece of history, the reason why the events in 48 unfolded the way they did is the Communist Party then became aware that it was going to do much worse in future elections. It was aware that its popularity was falling. It was doing worse and worse. It was not going to win the next elections. It was not going to take power democratically. And that was the reason for stepping up the use of violence and so on. So in a way, yes, Czechoslovakia has these differences, but it does conform to the general pattern.
It does. Right. Okay.
Thank you very much.